Do you all have a nice, tasty lunch? Some people are still having their lunch. This is good. Thanks for coming to the talk, an admin's guide to Git. Just as a quick sort of try and gauge where people are at. So who's an admin? Show of hands. Great, the title has worked. What's the sort of level of familiarity with Git? Do people use it day to day?
Yeah.
Couple, yeah. Who hasn't used it at all, really? Okay, great. Okay, cool. So this is pitched fairly like introductory, so it takes it back to first concepts of, what is version control, why is it useful, all that sort of stuff. So I'll focus on that a little bit, so I've pitched it correctly. So my name's Kevin. I'm the CEO of a company called GearSet. You hopefully saw us in the demo jam, where we didn't win, robbed. Home Backup's demo was excellent. They did a really good job, and I'm going to copy it for next year. So we've been running GearSet for the last 4 years now, 3-4 years. And over that time, I've just spoken with thousands of people and thousands of teams about how to adopt modern release practices, modern DevOps practices. So if you're a team that still uses change sets, I feel bad for you. How do we get you onto stuff that isn't as much of a pain? And the natural progression of where that leads you to is version control and Git. So I want to go through some of the things that we've learned from speaking to those teams. Loads of teams can get their developers onto Git. It's really natural from other ecosystems I've worked in. If you're working in Java or C# or JavaScript, you kind of version control is part of the just part of the package. It's kind of just assumed that that'll be there. So Salesforce developers have had an easier time moving to that, just because it's a little bit more natural with that workflow. But our whole thing is, well, Salesforce developers are only one small part of an overall Salesforce team, right? The beauty of the Salesforce platform is, it's a broad spectrum of people that are working on it, right? So if one half of your team is working in one way and one half of your team is working in another way, then that's not good for team productivity. And there's lots of advantages to version control as well. Often when people think of Git, they think of complexity. We often, in initial engagements with customers, if they're either using Git or they've read like a couple of books on Git and they're getting ready to do it, they end up with a branching strategy that looks something like this. It's really, really complex. And I've been a professional software engineer for 15 years. We shipped GearSet itself 3-4 times a day. We scaled from, the couple of us that started the company up to sort of 25 engineers working side by side now. And we don't have anything like this. So when I see these kinds of diagrams, I just go, no, everything should be simple. Just simple is the way forward for almost everything. So taking it back to absolute first principles, what is version control? It's just a way to track changes to files over time. And that's it, really. You've got this presentation was put together in Google Slides. I can go to any version of that, just like Google automatically checkpoints it for me. And that's all version control is. So it's a tool set that allows you to track changes to files over time. So a couple of caveats to that in the context of software engineering and configuration management and Salesforce, which is version control works best if the files that you're tracking changes to are text files. So that's when they work really best. If the thing that you can express can be expressed as just a series of characters. So if you're trying to version control an image, for example, it doesn't work so well. You can't get the same kinds of diffing and stuff. So if you can represent what the work you're doing as a text file, it'll work really well. It works well if you're working by yourself, but when you start working as a team, that's when version control really starts to pay dividends. And that's why, in the context of this sort of stuff, version control is for tracking changes to text files by teams. Why might you want to do this? The number one reason that teams really get value from it is not in the backup or any of that stuff, but in the way that it allows them to collaborate and provide feedback. So when I make my changes, it's really easy to just have a very granular view over what it was I changed. When I change something in the setup menu, instead of having to explain to a colleague, oh yeah, I searched for this, then I clicked there, and then I did that, I've got a really granular view over what it was I did, and my colleagues can provide feedback on that. There is some safety in that if I make mistakes, I know I've got a copy of this work somewhere else, so that's backed up to a central store. When you get new employees, instead of saying, giving them the Word doc that says, go get a sandbox and do this and this and this and this and this and this and this, and that doc being out of date from the last time somebody started, you can just say, go to our code repository, push out all of those changes out to a blank sandbox, and you end up with, the org that you should be working from. And similar to that feedback, you get visibility across the team. So as people are making changes, you're surfacing all of that. So as a team, there's less surprises hanging around. Some of the benefits that people tend to talk about, you get this single source of truth. So if you've gone to any presentation on version control or read any of the Salesforce DX literature, you'll see this phrase all the time. And it's worth definitely understanding what that means. So what single source of truth means is that the central repository that contains all of your code, all of your configuration, all of your profile data, your permission data, absolutely everything, that's the truth. So whatever the profile settings are in source control, that's what they should be. So if somebody's changed it in the org is wrong. And for our Salesforce professionals, this is a big shift. This is a big shift away from what we've all historically done, which is just make those changes directly in the org. The org is where our sales teams and our service teams are hanging out. Like, that's the source of truth. That's what they're doing with their day job. What we're saying now is, no, regardless of what's in the org, the source control system is right. And that means that if there is a discrepancy here, then our process is broken in some way, and we should, address that. So that's the idealized thing you want to go towards. There's obviously a gray area, and do it sensible for you and your team. Source control was designed, decades ago for parallel development streams. So if you have more than one group making changes to the same sort of conceptual org, they're doing different work. Maybe somebody's configuring some stuff for your marketing team, somebody's configuring for your sales team, they're configuring some shared objects or some shared profiles. That is really, really hard to do in an org-to-org model where you're using change sets. You have tools like GearSet that makes it easier, but we would always push teams towards adopting source control once those parallel streams get big enough, complex enough, and once you have enough parallel streams. Once you do start to have parallel streams, you're definitely going to end up changing the same thing. So I'm going to change something, and my colleague on another team is going to change the same thing in a different way. And in the old world, that was kind of hard to spot. So whichever one of us did the deployment last, did the release last, or shouted loudest, they would win. But that's not a good way to be, because that work was valuable too. So source control with that visibility, tracking, auditing provides a way to address those conflicts as and when they happen. You get the usual detailed audit trail, that collaboration again. And then that bottom one is important. So Salesforce DX. Salesforce have drawn a big old line in the sand and stuck their stake in that says this is the future of development in the platform. It's going to impact everybody. There's a move towards externalizing, getting that source of truth to be outside the org, stored somewhere else in a bunch of text files. And the first step to Salesforce DX, so before you start thinking about scratch orgs or packaging or any of that stuff, if your companies, your teams want to start moving towards Salesforce DX, if you don't have a version control system in place, if you don't have those skills, processes, practices, and knowledge in the team, then I would definitely start there first. So a few of the terms that get thrown around. So version control, as I said, is a mechanism for tracking changes to files. That's more or less it. The only one I'm going to focus on today, and probably the only one you should focus on unless there's a really good reason to use something else, is Git. So Git, over the last decade, has risen to be the most popular version control system for pretty much all software engineering ever. But particularly for Salesforce, it's the one that 99% of our customers use. So Git's a technology. It's a way of tracking changes to files. It understands when versions change and how to represent that and who made those changes, that kind of thing. But it's a fundamental enabling technology. You then need somewhere to store those files, as a place to put all of that source of truth. There's a whole bunch of those. So Atlassian have a product called Bitbucket. You may have come across. Microsoft now have GitHub acquired, and then Microsoft have Azure DevOps as well. So there's a bunch of these code hosting a bunch of code hosting services that'll host your repository and make it easier to move those changes around between environments. Repositories is just a name for a collection of files, just a name where you can put everything that belongs to a particular project or a team or whatever level of grouping makes sense to you. Typically, for most of the teams that we work with, they'll just have one for their Salesforce team, like no matter if that's multiple teams, or they'll just have one Salesforce repository. And then use branches, which give you an isolated view that's divergent away from the work that people are doing. So let's say you have, if we are saying that the source of truth is in the repository at all times, then how do I ever make changes? How do I make changes where I can experiment away from what we consider to be that source of truth? Branches provide a way to do that. They take essentially a copy of the files, or they start tracking changes separately. We'll go through this in a second with some diagrams to help explain it. But essentially it gives you a way where an isolated view, an isolated place, my own private sandbox, where I can change things without impacting the rest of my colleagues. So I can experiment, I can start to learn how to do things, I can make mistakes critically, I can move backwards in time if I've gone down a rabbit hole. And then only when I've done a bunch of work and I'm confident that it's correct, can I then say, hey, this work on this branch, on my view of the files, is now correct. I'd like that to get merged back into what we consider to be that source of truth. Commits. So as I was doing this documentation this slides in Google Docs is just like cleverly just snapshotting all the time every time I type something. But that means that there's about 500 versions of this presentation. Not all of them are very sensible. I don't know why I did those things. I have to look at like timestamps or anything. What commits do in a version control system is say with a person and a reason what I've changed. So I can say I've updated these profiles to allow these fields to be seen by these group of users. And I can say what my intent was when I clicked those buttons when I made that change. And that means if my colleagues come to review it later, they can say, well, we know you've changed the profiles. We can see technically what you've done, but that was incorrect with the business requirements that were asked. You've assigned it to the wrong group of users. So commits allow that meaning, the intent behind why you're making the changes. And then as I said, when I've done all that work, when it's been reviewed, we want to take those changes that I've made and push them back in so that source of truth now has my changes applied. And that's called merging. So we'll take the changes that I've made and merge them back in. There's a very dense in terms of definitions there. Is anybody any questions on those or anything that they want to clear up? Feel free to just shout things out. No? Okay, cool. A few common myths that we've come across from all the teams that we've spoken to. The most is that Git is only for developers and sort of Git is only for code. So Git is for your Apex code, maybe your Visual Force or your Lightning Web components. It's not for storing your flows or your process builder or anything like that. And that's nonsense. So anything you can do inside Salesforce should end up in a version control system. That should be your source of truth. So if your org was to just disappear at some point, that's okay, except that all my customer data is gone. That's okay because my configuration and my code are all stored together in the source control system. As I move that code forward that references fields and I make field changes at the same time, that's all going together at the same time. So Git is definitely not just for developers, and we have lots of teams now where everybody collaborates via the source control system. So it's not just for code, it's for both configuration and code. Anything you can do inside Salesforce should be source controlled. It's not about the command line, so there's lots of really good ways to interact with Git and with these Git hosting services like GitHub and Bitbucket. Some people do use the command line. If you already use the command line, if you use the command line day to day and you're happy using it, then yeah, using Git in the command line is another great way to work. I actually don't work that way, so I prefer to use some UI-based tools for Git, and there's lots and lots and lots of those. If you're using VS Code, if any of you come across that or seen your colleagues' desks, they have Git built in. Git built in, and there's a whole bunch of others. What I'm going to demo in a minute very quickly is gear set, pushing changes from Salesforce into Git, which hides even more of it as well. And the biggest myth we hear, we often speak to teams where they're just afraid to get started with Git. They've been working with change sets for so many years. They kind of know that. They're really good at it. And that org-to-org workflow makes a lot of sense to them. But Git's not hard. The journey that teams normally go on, we sort of think of this as a maturity matrix. The first way that everyone works, again, we support this a little bit, is If you think about that, do the thing that's simplest, that works for your team. When your team's really small, or if you haven't gone live or anything, people just make changes directly in production. Sometimes that's okay. It's mostly not okay, and you should mostly get away from it. But sometimes it's okay when you're very small. The classic thing that we see teams do then when they start to run into the issues that production changes, direct production changes cause for them, is move to this kind of workflow where you've got all of your developers and admins in developer sandboxes, either shared among a team or ideally isolated or some compromise hybrid between the two. They then either use things like change sets or gear set to move things into integration and then UAT and then into production. So the kind of classic flow. And if you're in this kind of model, you're probably ready for version control. If you're in this kind of model, then there's probably a few other maturity things you can do earlier. But if you're here and this is sort of working, but you're starting to run into some pains, or you want some of the benefits of version control, then this is a good time to start thinking about bringing in new ways of working. So all the stuff I've said about version control, I'm obviously an advocate. I think it's a great way of working, so why don't all projects use this? The biggest historically has been tooling limitations. So as I mentioned, version control has been designed over the last 40 years to work really well for text files. So you have to get that, the things you're clicking around inside Salesforce have to get out into text files. And that has historically been really, really difficult with Salesforce. You then have things like change sets that are totally native and proprietary and don't interrupt terribly well with the rest of the sort of ecosystem of developer tooling and continuous integration. Even when you do start to externalize things, so does anyone recognize this or know what this is? Bonus points and no prize for, no? This is a process builder. This is like if you do file new process builder and add a few steps. This is what Salesforce generates behind the scene. So it's a flow. This is essentially impenetrable. This was never designed to be read by humans. And lots of the Salesforce metadata is like that. So although it's technically a text file and can now be version controlled, this is a real pain to work with. This is not pleasant. And with Salesforce DX, they're doing stuff to improve that. But this is a big barrier. This is scary to a lot of people when they see this, when they're used to configuring, process builder in nicer ways. As I talked about some of the tooling as well, like this is just scary to people, and also not a terribly fast way to work if you don't need to. And the big one that we get with lots of teams, especially with working across a team, is not knowing what good looks like. So what branching strategy should you use? How should you use share changes? How should we do hot fixes where we do need to make that change in production right now? What does all that look like? So I'm going to give you a super quick demo. I didn't want this to be like a gear set demo too much because I do lots of those, and we have a booth, so if you want a longer one, I can give you a longer demo. But just to explain some of these concepts, I'm going to make a change inside Salesforce and then show you what this looks like when you share that change via the source control system. So I'm going to create a new field. It's going to be a pick list field. I'm going to call that my favorite Git client because teams love to argue about what is the one true way to interact with Git. So the CLI, VS Code, source tree. I heard a source tree, which I despise. But anyway, oh no, actually, Atlassian's great. You're going to get me in trouble. One of the guys in my team loves source tree, and he has never-ending problems with it. So I don't like it. But yeah, if you prefer it, then so be it. And then I'm going to make some changes to the profiles that has. I'm going to press next, and I'm going to press save. So we've made some changes in my dev org, and I now want to share this with the rest of my team, or with the source control system, certainly. I'll do the abridged version. So inside GearSets does lots and lots and lots of stuff, but essentially it allows you to move changes between any two environments. So if you want to move changes from dev to staging to UAT to production, and you hate change sets and paging through things and recreating change sets over and over, if you wish you had rollback and a detailed audit history, and so fewer confusing error messages and things, then GearSet's worth checking out. There's a free 30-day trial. So I'm going to pick that dev org where I've made those changes. I'm going to push to a source control system that's been initialized with the metadata from that org. And I'm going to quickly create a new branch. So this is my favorite Git client. So you can already see we're giving it a name. This branch now, this isolated view over these files, has a name that is a piece of work that I'm doing. So that could be a sprint story, it could be a Jira ticket, could be whatever it is. It has some context that isn't just me making changes in the setup menu, without that. What GearSet's doing now is grabbing all of the metadata from the source organization, and so that's using the metadata API, the same thing as ChangeSets is built on. And then the right-hand side, we're actually grabbing it from that Git repository, which is stored on GitHub. So at no point have I used the CLI. At no point have I had to think about XML and all that sort of stuff. I get to see here the value set that's being created by Salesforce, those values. I get to think about the permissions that have been created across all my profiles. So I can really start to drill down and look at this stuff. So I'm going to very quickly take those changes. Press next. GearSet's going to check the deployment for me. I'm going to ignore it because in this case I actually know better than GearSet. And I've got a developer back in Cambridge working on the fact that I know better than it at the moment. And then we've got a summary of what's about to happen. So we're going to deploy that new custom field into the source control system. The permissions and all the profiles have been updated. So we've defaulted to the name of the branch, but let's give a little bit more context. So this is adding a field to track Git client preference. And then source tree is great. So, so I'm going to press the deploy, and similar to how ChangeSets work, we're uploading this to the targets. This, if you're using GearSet in org-to-org mode, this would go to the org. But in this case, we're going directly to the source control system, where we can then share that with the rest of my colleagues. So in a second or two, we'll upload that to GitHub, which is open in this tab. And here you can see that favorite Git client branch has been created. So if I jump over to that, I can actually compare it. And I can see what I've done. And you can see all that XML now, all this sort of stuff that GearSet has hidden from you, because it's not really worth thinking about. OK. So that's sort of trying to get across that Git can be really, really simple. You can think in Salesforce terms. You don't need to think about complexity. And the big one that I want to get across as well is not backup. So if your team is only using Git as backup, then you're not using Git to its fullest potential. Production should make sure that whatever's done in production is in your master branch. Basically, Git is the thing that you care about more even than your org. If you see a discrepancy, you'll trust Git first. If you're not in that situation, then there's a little bit of work to be done. That development flow, just a diagram, what I did was I'd started from that view of the files that my entire team shares. I created a feature branch off it. I did a bunch of stuff, and then I'll merge that back. So real simple. If you compare that to the thing that I showed at the very start, with branches going everywhere and lots and lots of complexity, this is what we use on GearSet. And we've scaled this to, say, 20, 30 software engineers working together, shipping code to production 3 times a day. And this is the way we work. And I don't know, maybe when we get to 60 developers working in parallel, we'll have to bring in more complexity, but until then, let's not do that. We can go into some of the nuances of how you deal with hotfixes and things like that, how teams work together, where you might have some developers that actually like making changes in the IDE using VS Code or Eclipse. And as long as everybody's sharing through the source control system, through feature branches, then it doesn't matter how you actually like to work or which tool you want to use. Further reading is at gearset.com/resources, where we've got a white paper. I'm happy to hang around and answer questions, though, or the booths at the back of the room as well. As I say, we've spoken to thousands of teams over the last couple of years. We've probably seen every mistake that can be made and have some good war stories that I won't let be recorded. So just come and ask us any questions. The takeaways are version control is really, really powerful. It's not difficult. It's going to become the future of the platform. It already is for a lot of teams. But if your company isn't at least thinking about it, you probably definitely want to get ahead of what DX is going to bring for you. and give it a go. It's really surprising how many people that we've worked with that have sort of initially been a little bit skeptical, or either I don't need it or I'm a bit afraid of it, and they end up loving it within just a few weeks of working that way. I don't know if I'm good for time. I think I probably need to, yeah, so we'll ask questions outside the room. So thank you very much.